If you're right that the use of restraint remains high and is not used as a last resort, am I right that that would involve breach of Rule 50 of the YOI rules, 2000?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. Well, that's my understanding too. And if there are breaches of the YOI rules taking place on a fairly regular basis, isn't that a rather shocking situation and one that one would expect government to address?
Well, I think that it is a very disturbing situation. And again, as I come into this new and not, it strikes me as a very disturbing situation that force can be used in that way against people who are children and who are vulnerable in all the ways that we know that. And I do think there ought to be a much, as I said, there is a rule that appears to be clear, but it doesn't appear to be taken or enforced as clearly as we might want.
If if restraint involving pain was abolished overnight, would you fear any significant deficit in the orderliness of the YOI's in Spain?
Well, I think there may be some, let's be clear what I'm saying. I think there may be some occasions in which it is necessary for the safety of the young person or others to restrain them. Right? So I'm not saying that there aren't any circumstances in which a young person should be restrained. I think there are some circumstances in which a young person should be restrained. And I accept that in some occasions where a young person is being restrained, that might hurt them. Right? That's in, you're talking about a very extreme situation.
But that's a result rather than an objective.
Exactly, right? That's a different thing from saying, I will hurt this young person to stop them doing what they're doing, or worse, I will hurt these young people so they do what I want them to do. Right? So I think it is necessary to restrain young people sometimes in extreme circumstances, and I think, but I don't think avoiding pain, not using pain advice would lead to a breakdown in order in one way. But there are a series of things that have to go with that. You do have to have proper staffing levels. You have to have secure and stable staff. You have to have an environment and scale of institution that's kind of manageable. It's not and that's what I said right at the beginning. I think it's not simply a question of this technique or that technique. It's a question of a whole institution approach to safety in which the physical force use is almost an end product of purposeful activity, the way young people are treated in their relationships with staff, the way other vulnerabilities are dealt with. So I think if you get those things right, then I think it is feasible to safely.
Yes.
Lorraine Kahn from the Centre for Mental Health. I'm wondering whether you think there's enough use of de-escalation techniques.
I was going to ask the very same question, yes.
And I asked that because about 3 years ago I saw one of the most, a very troubled young woman who wasn't contained within a secure training centre, had mental health difficulties which have since developed, and she was very challenging. She was but in one particularly secure children's home. I observed a drama therapy session where she did blow up at the end of it, but was managed in a very different way to anything that I'd previously seen in a secure setting, and that was through two workers who were talking her down, even though she was throwing chairs, and they were successful with that. They removed everybody else. So I think there's a different, and they have a very strong de-escalation training strategy.
I was going to ask actually almost precisely the same question, with the observation of my own made in local authority secure children's homes, that de-escalation techniques were well refined and used very patiently by extremely well trained staff. Now there may be a few premises there. Is it your view that there is sufficient training in YOIs, in de-escalation techniques, and that they're sufficiently well understood?
Well, I think that is important. alternative to youth support. We have seen an improvement and an increase in staff using de-escalation techniques. So we have seen that, although it's not universal. As far as I'm aware, there is only one institution, Ashfield, where, so where staff receive specific training in de-escalation techniques. And that is something we would like. On the whole, we don't comment on training as part of the management of the institution, but I think, straight to my head, is something I think it would be sensible to extend to other institutions. So
is there any evidence of that having produced results in Ashfield?
Yes, there is evidence of that. There does seem to produce results in Ashfield.
And the lady who asked the question referred to mentally ill offenders, and I regard this myself as an extremely important question. In the reduced number of prisoners, of those who are detained, inevitably one will find an increasing percentage who are suffering from identifiable mental illnesses, in many cases clusters of identifiable mental illnesses. Is there any evidence of consideration being given in individual institutions in relation to individual residents as to whether restraint should be used having regard to their mental condition and sometimes panoply of mental conditions?
I'm not aware of that. That's not to say that it never happens, but I personally am not aware of it. I haven't seen that in any inspection reports or inspections that I've been on, so I'm not aware of that. Again, it might be something I can come back to from asking colleagues for their advice on that. I think what I might say is that just one of the issues, just perhaps to highlight on this, is it's not just a matter of training is part of the issue, but also what's important is you have a stable, experienced and well-motivated staff group. The staff who want to work with young people learn to be relatively stable. And certainly we've been concerned in some institutions, Woodward, for instance, comes to mind, where they had trouble because of the recruitment freeze, they had problems recruiting permanent staff, so you had a big turnover of staff and people were brought in to fill in vacancies, and that undoubtedly made the management of the institution more difficult. So training is part of it, but in terms of staffing issue generally, it's a stable, experienced group of staff who want to be there, who want to work with that age group.
Just a final question. Is there, in your view, any evidence that race plays a part in the likelihood or otherwise of young men in custody being restrained?
I think the evidence about that is inconclusive, but there is certainly evidence that from our surveys that young people's from black and minority ethnic groups' perceptions of what happens and what they tell us happens to them is worse proportionately than their wider counterparts. In individual institutions, it's difficult to pick that out. If you look at the survey results as a whole, there is some evidence to that. There is some indications that need further investigation.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. I think that's been most helpful.